All right, guys. This is different than your Gaza sit rep. I am going to talk about Venezuela today. And there's a degree of popular demand in the sense that people have been asking me how to make sense of what's going on with the ramping aggression against Venezuela by the US. These repeated attacks on boats. I think we're up to 5 or 6 boats that have been blown up by the Americans in the Caribbean Sea. And I'm partly, people have been asking, and partly for myself, I've felt that I have to report on this as well, with the other things that are going on. So I don't know. I have been getting the feeling that this is going to ramp up to the point of a full-on kind of kinetic war against Venezuela. I'll tell you why I think that's the case. But yeah, it seems harder and harder to imagine that outcome not being the case. And for that reason, I think I'll start reporting these and really hoping that it comes to nothing. As someone in my position always does, I really fervently hope that everything that I'm doing here in these reports amounts to nothing. So we're about early October, and I think I'm recording this on October 26th, but it hasn't been too long that the Americans did this. I think one of the first strikes was around September the 2nd. They claimed that it was the first drug boat that they blew up, but now I think we're up to 5. I think they just did one yesterday. So the method of these attacks, and this is I'm just starting with this because this is why I'm here, obviously, is because of these attacks on these boats. But the method of these attacks is simply, with no warning, for the United States to bomb a boat. They show a video openly, publicly, of the boat being blown up. We later find out that the people killed on the boat were Trinidadian, Colombian, Venezuelan. There's almost no rhyme or reason to who is being killed on these boats or what's happening on these boats. There's no way to present evidence that these were drug boats. No one really knows what a drug boat is. And it's not presented by the Americans as some kind of systematic intervention into the drug trade. It's after the fact, after they blow up the boat and kill all these people, they say, "This we're going to keep doing this. We blow up this boat. It was a drug boat, and we're going to keep blowing these up." And this is so different from the already abusive, already horrific war on drugs model that the Americans have been engaged in the Americas for decades. And I'm going to try to talk about all of the intersections of all of the things that have led us to this point. The war on drugs is one. The U.S. intervention in Colombia is another, and the U.S. attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government for several decades now is another. And this is my angle on it. Other people might have other angles on it, but my angle on it is as someone who knows Colombia really well, who knows Venezuela really well, who's been to both countries a bunch of times, who has really good friends in both countries or from both countries, From my vantage point, somebody who grew up in Canada, somebody with an Indian background, who knows Palestine and that, cause. For me, Colombia and Venezuela are so, somebody, I think either Gustavo Petro from Colombia or Maduro, I can't remember who, called them cousins. They're not even cousins. It's really the same country. They were part of the same country when they achieved independence. They achieved independence together as part of, it was called Gran Colombia at the time. And they, the same people, they eat the same things, they sound the same to my foreign ears, their Spanish accent is the same. The regional differences between regions in each of these countries is bigger than the differences between them. I mean, you could say this about all of Latin America, right? Nuestra America. That these are all such contrived artificial borders and differences that have been exploited by the Americans, again, the North Americans, to plunder their economies, the economies of the South of the Americas, and get their labor at cut rates, both with people who are living where they live, and as well as people who come as migrants under these terrible conditions and are then deported back to prison camps elsewhere in Latin America, like El Salvador. Okay, so we have the drug boats, and I'm gonna get to a chronology about the war on drugs. So let me give you, first of all, the context of the drug war, the actual drug war, not the phony, or not this thing that they're doing right now, where they're just blowing up any boat, which is more like a naval war, more like naval terrorism. It's not piracy, because pirates try to steal the cargo of the boat. It's not it's not naval warfare, because they're attacking civilian boats and they're just attacking them with no warning and no military objective. It's terrorism. It's naval terrorism. But the war on drugs. So the war on drugs, and I'm going to give you a view of the war on drugs that's focused on Colombia. So Colombia, for a long time, decades now, has been a major producer of coca. The coca is a leaf the peasants of the Andes grow, cultivate, and use. It enables them to survive in higher elevations, chewing the coca leaf, making a tea out of it. It's a plant that's of a lot of importance to the indigenous cultures of that region. And refining it and turning it into cocaine is something that was done, as far as I know. I could be wrong, but as far as I know, it was actually more of an imperial project. Coca-Cola, as you may know, was laced with this cocaine. As far as I know, it was around the 19th century that they started concentrating the medicinal part of the coca leaf and turning it into this drug. And the drug has all kinds of benefits. It does all kinds of things. And of course, it becomes this illegal drug stimulant that then becomes the subject of a drug war. In the 1980s, the drug war has two wonderful things. It does two wonderful things for the American imperialists, right? On the one hand, it enables them to intervene in Colombia and other South American countries. It enables them to intervene in those countries' politics. It enables them to send their agents on the ground, infiltrate criminal organizations there, infiltrate the government there, dictate what goes on there, get into aerial fumigation, tear up peasants' crops. They have their military running around. They train and equip and, again, order ultimately the Colombian military to do all these things. They do the same in Bolivia. There's these projects where the drug war that America is fighting gives them this pretext and this entire infrastructure of intervention in the South America, in Colombia especially. Then, domestically, the drug war facilitates the expansion of the prison complex, prisons, the expansion of police departments, the expansion of the entire justice system, which employs millions of people and is such a huge part of America's self-image and, cops and cop culture and cop worship. And without drugs and drug offenses, there's almost nothing for these police to do. So giving jobs to this massive police, prison, justice system of America, that's a huge part of how Americans see themselves. This is a major part of the drug war, and that is ever expanding, and it grows and grows and grows. So we have a pretext for foreign intervention. We have a pretext for this massive police infrastructure to exist. And then, by intervening and controlling the criminal activity itself, the US also captures US illegal corporations and covert entities actually capture most of the money that's made as well. So peasants grow coca. They sell to some local baron. The local baron undertakes the high risk production of coca paste, and then the coca paste gets further refined into cocaine. The cocaine gets shipped through various illegal routes from Colombia to the Caribbean to the US, where it's sold at street values that are massively higher than the values that it's sold for in the country of origin. Again, we can stick to Colombia here. And the profits are made by American middlemen and American dealers and especially American police and American covert agencies that are actually corrupted or corrupting or corruptors in the process of getting these drugs, because you can't actually get illegal material into the United States unless you have participation from the state agencies one way or another. So corruption is a huge part of it. And then the big money ends up in Western banks in the Caymans or Switzerland or these places where the city of London, where they stash the money. So the Americans control the commanding heights of the illegal drug economy. They control the agencies that police and regulate that illegal economy and incarcerate the criminals and punish them and catch them and procure all the wonderful equipment that the American police require and use. And they also operate this infrastructure of intervention. So really and truly, illegal drugs and the drug war are gifts that keep on giving. And, it's true of what's true of coca and cocaine is true of other drugs too. It's the same kinds of systems. And the source, you've probably seen the diagram of the different smuggling routes. And Venezuela is not a transshipment point. Venezuela is not a major producer. Venezuela is just there. It's Colombia's neighbor. It's not. That's pretty much what Venezuela's involvement is. I have this. Joe Emersberger and I wrote this article, and I'll just show this. I'll just share this with you because this is an image that people have been using a lot. It comes from 2016 non-commercial maritime events from Colombia and Ecuador to Guatemala and Mexico. So these are the routes by which the drugs go. And you can see Venezuela, there's things going from Venezuela, but it's nothing like the scale from Colombia or Ecuador. And okay, so those are the basics. That's Drug War 101. Okay, now let me give you Colombia Counterinsurgency 101. So the Americans are in Colombia, and they have been in Colombia since the 1960s. So Colombia has I don't know, I think it's fair to say a particularly violent history. The Americas are extremely violent. The US is the most violent. Canada is probably second most violent in terms of what was done to indigenous peoples here. And in Colombia, in Mexico, in places in Argentina, there was Brazil, tremendous violence against indigenous populations to begin these countries, and then colonies, and then independent countries, and the violence goes on. Colombia has had a lot of civil war. They've had a lot of democratic votes and a lot of civil war. So they're not characterized by long stretches of single party or individual dictatorship. Neither is Venezuela, actually. They're characterized by long periods of power sharing between parties and wars between parties. So there was a decades-long Colombian civil war that started. Some people date from 1948, and others date from 1962 or 64. So in 1948, a war broke out between the liberals and the conservatives. There were liberal guerrillas, and the conservatives were in power, and that war went on for decades. The liberal guerrillas some of them morphed into communist guerrillas, and the FARC, the armed forces, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, was born in 1964, and they fought on until I think around 2012. There was a peace deal in I think around 2012. It was ratified a little bit later, and so the FARC are no longer considered combatants. In order to combat the guerrillas, though, the Colombian state accepted help, and bases and their officers and their intelligence services all went to America and have exchange programs, and they're trained and ultimately supervised by the American military. And there's a school it was called the School of the Americas. It's called something else now. And there are military schools where officers from the Colombian army, anybody in the Colombian military does training in America, in the US. And likewise for the intelligence agencies and the DEA and the CIA, and all of those agencies have incredible amounts of participation and agents all over Colombia and bases there. So Colombia is, and that's been the case since the 1960s. And the kind of narcos, if you watch Narcos, if you watched the various movies about the Colombian drug gangs and trade, Pablo Escobar, you would have seen that this drug war was a complete shooting war with unbelievable, shocking atrocities and a huge degree of political control by the narco traffickers, the narco businesses, the narco capitalists, as well as the Americans. Now, the Americans also purported to be in Colombia to fight the guerrillas. So the left-wing guerrillas are all over Latin America, right? There are guerrillas in left-wing guerrilla forces and guerrilla armies from the 1960s on in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Mexico, many different kinds. Those are just the ones I know, all over Central America, right? Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, there are all these fronts. You probably know a little bit about them from the 80s. So lots of communist and left-wing guerrilla movements, nationalists, all fighting for the control of their own resources following the Cuban Revolution, 1959, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara. Those are the model, and guerrillas in the 1960s tried to follow those. In Colombia had a bunch. They had the FARC, they had the the Army of National Liberation, the ELN, Ejército de la Liberación Nacional. They had M19, which is like the movement of April 19th. That's a guerrilla group that was founded on a specific day, so they gave themselves that name. There were several, and in Mexico there's also a whole bunch, the EZLN, the Zapatistas, and then the EPR. There are lots of different guerrilla movements in these different countries. And I think Castro and Cuba was the one everybody looked up to as a successful revolution. So, and of course, Che Guevara died in Bolivia trying to spawn a guerrilla movement in Bolivia as well, and was captured by an American intervention with a lot of American participation in his capture and his ultimate death, right, in Bolivia in the 60s. So the American strategy for defeating the Colombian guerrillas was to develop a paramilitary force. So the idea is the guerrillas are irregular, the guerrillas are in the countryside, the guerrillas are popularly supported, the guerrillas exist among the people. And so the way to defeat them is to use these paramilitaries to attack the social base of the guerrillas. If the guerrillas are based in the peasants, the paramilitaries will attack the peasants. They'll go and massacre peasants. They say that the guerrillas are organizing the working class, so the paramilitaries assassinate unionists. They say that the guerrillas are in African communities, indigenous communities, so the paramilitaries go and massacre these communities. How do you generate paramilitary forces that have the ability to go and massacre people all over the country? How does that happen? Well, those paramilitaries are supported by the state. In many cases, they are the army. They just rip their patch off, or sometimes they don't even. They work hand in glove with the military. They also link the military and the narco traffickers. So the right-wing paramilitaries are there working with the government, working with the state, working with politicians, and trying to massacre the left-wing guerrillas and rebels. That's been the story of Colombia for decades, up until the peace deal, and now the paramilitaries continue to operate, even though the guerrillas, for the most part, do not. Now, the presence of the Americans in military terms, in covert operations terms, in narco trafficking terms, in Colombia, the complete infiltration of the US into Colombia through those several vectors has enabled them to use Colombia as a launch pad for trying to overthrow Venezuela. Why do they want to overthrow Venezuela? Now, let me give you a little bit of chronology of Venezuela. Venezuela, like Colombia, had guerrilla movements up in the mountains, inspired by the Cubans, inspired by the Colombians. Actually, they had all of this history of these peasant guerrillas and intellectuals. There was almost no country in Latin America that was not touched by this kind of guerrilla movement in the 1960s. But ultimately they were crushed. And the government of Venezuela, where if you look at the liberals and the conservatives in Colombia and how they fought this huge war, in Venezuela, they kind of solved this by having the two big parties, the Democratic Action Party, which was kind of like the liberals, and the Christian Patriots, which was kind of like the conservatives. And they developed a very special agreement called Punto Fijo, the Punto Fijo agreement. And it happened in, let me just double check, 1958. So the Christian Party and the Democratic Action and a third party, the Democratic Republican Union, Democratic Republicans, they basically created this Punto Fijo Pact in 1958 to alternate in power. So imagine if instead of pretending that they were two different parties, the Republicans and the Democrats made a formal agreement that 4 years they'd have a Republican president, 4 years they'd have a Democratic president, 4 years, every 2 years the Congress would alternate between Republicans and Democrats. It's that kind of thing. And Venezuela, which had been a cacao superpower, which is not quite as lucrative, when oil was discovered there, they became a major petroleum power. And so they developed a state oil company, which again ultimately was about selling the state's oil to America, and for American purposes and for American policy. And the oil wealth went to enrich party cronies, landlords, various of the wealthiest elite of the country. So in the 1980s, you had like one of these many neoliberal kinds of governments that believed in cutting services and cutting whatever minimal things that people had. And in 1989 in Venezuela, in particular, the Venezuelans woke up in Caracas one morning and discovered the bus fare had gone up 200% or something. So riots followed, and the riots were brutally crushed by the government. So this process in 1989 was called the Caracazo. It's like an aso. When you say A-Z-O, it's like a blow, you know, like a puñazo or whatever, the Caracazo. So it was like the blow that was struck in Caracas. And the uprising, hundreds of people at least were killed by the army. And the army, a lot of people in the army, a lot of soldiers in the army didn't like how it went down. They didn't like participating in repression at that scale, and they wanted to see change. So one of these officers that had participated in the Caracazo was Hugo Chavez, and Hugo Chavez, his job was like an educator in the army, so he was a kind of a teacher, and he and a group of other officers decided that they didn't want to be massacring Venezuelans on the streets. That was not their idea of a patriotic army. And in 1992, Chavez tried to overthrow the kind of punto fijo system and establish a coup. So and overthrow them through a coup d'état, a bloodless coup d'état. So Chavez was caught, the coup d'etat didn't come off, and Chavez went on TV and he said, I take responsibility for this. And he said, for now, por ahora, I want everybody to stand down. And that was a big deal politically. Nobody had ever heard any political person say they took responsibility. And they took a lot of comfort when he said por ahora. So he went to jail. He came out of jail a few years later, and they ran for office, and they won. Surprise! I think they lost the first time, and then they won the second time. So they were surprised to win, and then they started this process of trying to change the constitution, trying to establish popular control over the oil company, to bring in Cubans to teach medicine and establish rural healthcare, to give people all these benefits that they had never had before, despite having all this oil wealth. So when people say like Venezuela was prosperous and socialism ruined it, actually Venezuela, had a lot of money from the oil, but Venezuelans were very poor and didn't have even basic things like rural healthcare or education, right? Free education. And there's even kind of packets of groceries and packages and things like that people didn't have, that the Chavez government, established. And they established them in spite of a lot of opposition from the bureaucracy, from the government bureaucracy, from the oil company bureaucracy, and from the police and from the establishment in many ways. So they kept using the democratic mechanisms and organization in the neighborhoods, but they also used the army, and they did these missions. So there were a lot of things that the Chavistas did to circumvent all the sophisticated opposition that the elites were putting in the path of what came to be called the Bolivarian Revolution. So Chavez looks back at Simon Bolivar, who was the liberator, who was the leader of the independence movement of all of these countries. Again, Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela, Peru, all of these were a part of Panama, were all part of Gran Colombia in the 19th century. You can listen to my historical podcast if you want to hear that story. So where am I? Yeah. So Venezuela has this socialist government. They're trying to take control of the oil, and they're also big believers in Latin American and South American integration. So they want better ties between South-South. They want this ALBA, a Bolivarian alliance. They wanted to set up Telesur, which was like a kind of an Al Jazeera, well, hopefully better than Al Jazeera, like an independent broadcasting. So they're not just, everybody's not just watching CNN in Spanish, right? So the idea of independent sovereign broadcasting, independent sovereign media, independent sovereign food sovereignty, independent oil energy sovereignty. Sowing the oil is a word that they used, where they said, we want to use the oil to build society rather than, create this resource to make rich people even richer. That project, the so-called Bolivarian Revolution, the Chavista project, that became the target in the Americas from when it started in around 1998. 1998 is when they came to power, when Chavez came to power, and the American attempts to overthrow Chavez began in 1998 as well. And analysts that I knew in the 2000s, there was a big project called Plan Colombia, which was this counterinsurgency, like, remember the seamlessness of the American view that they were fighting drugs and guerrillas, even though the guerrillas were left wing and the drugs were right wing. And the Americans were always on the side of the right wing end of the drugs. They were really there to fight the guerrillas, and they were ultimately there to fight and to have this base to try to from which to try to overthrow Venezuela, to try to overthrow Chavez. And so in 2000 was Plan Colombia. 2002, Chavez was overthrown for a period of 48 hours or so. If you guys have the chance to watch the documentary, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, by these Irish documentarians, it is incredible. It's still one of the best documentaries ever, in my view. It tells the story from the inside of that coup. You watch the coup happen, and then you watch them recover and Chavez come back from the coup. So it's like one of the most incredible stories of all time. And then immediately after Chavez and the Chavistas reversed that coup, there was a strike, an oil strike, where the senior management of the oil company tried to halt oil production. And again, that was defeated by the oil workers mobilizing and oil students, Chavista students. There's amazing stories of what people did to try to overcome that strike. Then the opposition moved into a bit of an official mode. They tried to use the recall referendum provision. They lost the recall referendum and they claimed fraud. That was when the institutional attempt to try to claim that the Chavistas were not following proper electoral procedure. So there's a lot of that. There was also in, I believe, 2003, several paramilitary invasions and coup plots that were foiled, assassination plots where Colombian paramilitaries were on the Venezuelan border at large landowner ranches planning big attacks, and they were foiled by Venezuelan intelligence or Venezuelan police. And that happened a couple times. Colombia tried to procure a bunch of tanks. Venezuela diplomacy, they were trying to purchase them from Spain, and Venezuela convinced Spain to cancel the sale. So there were so many attempts to use Colombia as a launch point, even decades ago. And then even more of that in more recent years. So that institutionality kind of critique the Americans used when they said Juan Guaido is going to actually be the legitimate president and Maduro is not. And then what else? Guaido, yes. And then Guaido made an attempt to invade Venezuela from Colombia, from the Colombian border, and that also kind of fizzled. American mercenaries tried to attack Venezuela. They were foiled and arrested and caught, and some of them were exchanged for Venezuelans who were being held in El Salvador in these dungeons, and also one of the Venezuelans who was a Venezuelan businessman who was detained, kidnapped by the Americans, claiming that he was sanctions busting, which is to say he was trying to procure various things for Venezuela that the Americans have decided they're not allowed to have, like food or spare parts for their oil industry, etc. So sanctions has been a major weapon against Venezuela. Massive human suffering, tens of thousands of people have died as a result of the sanctions. And periodic attempts at violent overthrow, as well as these procedural tricks and hybrid war. So I think that is the three inputs to the war that we're seeing in terms of history. We have Colombian history. We have the war on drugs, which is related, and we have Venezuelan Revolution. And the ultimate target of all of this is the Venezuelan Revolution and the Venezuelan people, but it's also the Colombian people. It's also increasingly now Gustavo Petro is in the crosshairs. And, you know, I have some critique of Petro because Petro hasn't shown, I don't think, the solidarity to Maduro that I think is due. Petro says some good things. Petro is of the left, unmistakably. I think he's got a lot of integrity. But I think that the response by people like Petro and Lula and other Latin American leaders that are kind of softer is not gonna help right now. We need, you know, the Americas, if they're gonna survive this onslaught by the United States, they really need to hang together, and they really need to hang together no matter how radical some of their leaders are, even if Maduro's policies make them a bit uncomfortable. If it's because he's too radical, I just feel like too bad. If you're listening, Gustavo Petro, please, if you're listening to this, please consider this. So now I'm going to conclude tonight with why I'm so worried, why this is so worrying. So we can talk in future about what Venezuela has in terms of armaments, in terms of air defense, what kinds of relationships they have. They have a good relationship with Iran. They have a decent relationship they have a fantastic relationship with Cuba. Cuban intelligence has been phenomenal in helping them foil all of these coup attempts. They have a good relationship with Russia and China, and all of this coalition of the sanctioned, this coalition of the people that are damned that the United States wants to overthrow and destroy, which is increasingly most of the world. And Venezuela has Iran has helped Venezuela get their oil industry going despite sanctions, and Russia has provided various kinds of weapon systems. The Venezuelans don't want to rely on American weapon systems that the Americans could probably just press a button and turn off. So we can talk about the details of that. There are some details there. But ultimately, I think this, because in warfare, the proximity is important, and Venezuela is really close to the U.S. and the U.S. has a lot of advantages if they're trying to attack a country in the Americas. They are already everywhere. They are so even if Venezuela has air defense, they could make bombing runs costly. But if the U.S. is determined, I don't see, and we'll investigate this together in the coming weeks and months. Hopefully, again, for nothing. Hopefully, we'll investigate this together for no good reason. But my intuition is that if the U.S. is determined, then the Venezuelans will make it costly, and then their air defense will probably be destroyed by a determined attack by the U.S. or a series of attacks, an air battle, so to speak, an air defense battle. It's not like trying to do this in Yemen all the way across the ocean. The U.S. can deploy so many resources from so close, and so that's number one. to remember is the proximity of this. So the power projection of the US in the Americas is so much more than anywhere else. And the allies, the investment of allies in helping Venezuela compared to the investment of the Americans in their Monroe Doctrine backyard is it's going to be a bit of a mismatch for these distant allies who have a long tradition of letting America do whatever they want in the Americas. You know, so the Latin Americans have often been on their own. I mean, again, during the Cold War, there's a little bit of support from Moscow, but not very much. Everything the Latin Americans did, they did pretty much on their own in terms of their revolutions and their nationalist projects. So the key to getting out of this graciously or getting out of this at all is going to be the stance taken by the other Latin American and Caribbean countries, but especially the big ones. So Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, they need to hang together with Venezuela here, or this kind of terrorism, the American kind of naval terrorism is where they start. Trump has said the plan is to extend this to land. We're going to do it on land as well. He said something like that. Now, to me, the next likely escalation is bombing Venezuelan government buildings, claiming they're doing it. They'll just make it up like they've been doing. We bombed drug infrastructure. We bombed Maduro's. We bombed the presidential palace. It's a drug palace. I mean, they don't. The stupidity of it doesn't have to be any kind of impediment to doing that, right? To making these claims. So that is likely the escalation. They're gonna add airstrikes to sanctions and attempt to squeeze and continue to isolate Venezuela. And so, the best thing that could happen is a really strong stance taken by all of the America's countries saying, no, this is totally unacceptable. And maybe some kind of way out can be found that way. Otherwise, I see the Americans escalating to bombings, but I don't know about a ground invasion. I don't know about that. I think they're more likely to try to get the Colombians to fight, or try to get, which Petro said is not going to happen, but in a year, Petro might be replaced by a fascist right-wing government, which Colombia has had lots of over the years. And they're waiting in the wings. They're very, very patiently waiting for their next round in government. The Americans will also rely on Venezuelan, opposition to take the armed route, and they've tried. They've had military officers and coup attempts in the past. I imagine the Venezuelan military is pretty coup-proof now. I imagine the Venezuelan cities and countryside are pretty invasion. I don't think that this would be a good time for a ground invasion by the Americans, but that's not really, I don't think that's in the cards. I think what they're going to try to do is use proxies, use bombing, use sanctions. These are the weapons that they favor. And time. They're going to try to do it over time, and they're going to try to make the economy scream. And they're trying to add pressure to this intolerable level. And also, what we're talking about is something that Abdel Malik al-Houthi in Yemen said. He said they're trying to create a doctrine of permissibility. This was what he said this is what the Israelis are trying to do. And that's part of what I think, a big part of what Rubio and Trump are doing, is just trying to normalize the idea that the Americans can just blow boats up, You just blow boats up. You just bomb things out of nowhere with no warning. And that kind of establishment of, you know, the kind of an Israeli world. We're in this Israeli world where the Americans and the Israelis can bomb who they like whenever they want, kill people, and nobody can do anything about it. If all of these countries stand really strong and possibly, you know, start thinking about consequences, even just cutting off relations or downgrading relations with the US, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that happening. But that, I think, could make a big difference in terms of trying to find a diplomatic way out of this situation and de-escalation. So I think the goal, as much as like overthrowing Maduro in the short term, is, I don't know if that's such a goal. I don't know if the Americans can even pull that off. But more than that, I think they are creating precedents. They're creating this idea of permissibility. They're creating this normalization of naval terrorism and soon probably bombing. You know, in the Americas, when the US has done, whether it's drug wars or counterinsurgency, it's pretty rare. You know, you have Panama in 1989, you have Grenada, I think it was 1984, but it's pretty rare to have like a real bombing and invasion. It's not common for the Americans to just start blowing boats up. They much prefer to use locals, sponsor, train, equip, ideologically prepare local right-wing reactionary fascist forces to do massacres on their behalf. That's what they did in El Salvador. They did it in Colombia. They've tried repeatedly to get that going in Venezuela, and they get it going a little bit in Venezuela. Lots of hundreds or maybe thousands of Venezuelans have died in violent deaths because of American sponsored actions. But this direct bombing, just kind of putting that on the table as a thing that they do now with just fully lies, fully made up excuses, that's a really deadly new development. And that is I think that's the main thing. That's the main part of the story to understand, is that the Americans are creating they're trying to create this new thing that people are get used to, which is that they have this right to do this new violent act. So with those threads, I think I'll stop there. I think that's enough of a backgrounder. And what I'll do in future reports is report on the latest bombing. I'll give you a report on the latest bombing. I'll give you some of the words that have been spoken by the likes of Petro or Maduro or any other kind of relevant speech, or maybe an article, maybe someone important or maybe someone insightful and has done an analysis. I'll share those, and then we can get into some military analysis as well about what kinds of weapons are there, what the ships that the Americans have there, the kinds of bombing that they're doing, the defenses that Venezuela has, the options Venezuela has. Now, I think that Venezuela has been pretty wise in not trying to hit the Americans back. I think that the Americans would like nothing more right now than to be in a kinetic war with Venezuela, and restraint Venezuela's strategy seems to be simultaneously restraint and preparation for invasion, preparation for further attack, and then it's also up to the region. It shouldn't be up to Venezuela. It's not just Venezuelans that are getting killed on these boats. It's Trinidadians, Colombians. I've read about people that, they're bombing anywhere in the Caribbean. And it should be a common responsibility of all of us, of humanity. The Canadian Prime Minister was laughing about these bombings of boats. These are your neighboring countries in the Americas. It's a disgrace to laugh like that. And it shouldn't fall entirely on the Venezuelans to address this. So I'm going to leave it there. Patria o muerte? I'm not sure how I'll sign off. We'll figure something out in the meantime. And I'll see you on the next one.